The equation that changed everything. A story from the Black Voices. There is something about the smell of chalk dust and old wood that takes you back. Takes you back to a time when the world felt both enormous and small at the same time. When you sat in a classroom and wondered if anyone could see what was really inside you. This is a story about that feeling. About a young man who carried something extraordinary inside him. And about the long road it sometimes takes for the world to finally see it. Westbrook University sat on the edge of a small Midwestern city. The kind of city where the leaves turned gold every October and the people moved a little slower than they did in the big coastal towns. The math department occupied the oldest building on campus. A 4-story brick structure with tall narrow windows and hallways that echoed when you walked through them. Room 214 was on the second floor. It was a lecture hall with old wooden desks arranged in rows facing a long blackboard that covered nearly the entire front wall. The kind of blackboard that had absorbed decades of equations. Decades of ideas. Decades of young minds trying to reach for something greater than themselves. Professor Gerald Hartman had been teaching in that room for 22 years. He was 61 years old now. Silver-haired and broad-shouldered. A man who wore dark suits and blue ties the way other men wore comfortable old sweaters. He had been brilliant once. He had published papers. He had spoken at conferences in Vienna and Tokyo and Montreal. He still believed he was brilliant. And that was the problem. Because somewhere along the years of teaching the same courses over and over again. Somewhere in the comfortable certainty of being the smartest man in the room. Gerald Hartman had stopped being curious. He had started being certain. And certain men stopped seeing what is right in front of them. Marcus Okafor walked into room 214 on the first Monday of the fall semester. He was 19 years old. Tall and lean with close-cropped dark hair and a black hoodie that looked like it had been through a few too many wash cycles. He carried a plain notebook and a single pen. No backpack full of color-coded highlighters. No laptop. No fancy calculator. Just the notebook and the pen and eyes that moved slowly around the room taking everything in. He sat in the third row from the back. Not the very back where students go to hide. Not the very front where students go to perform. The third row from the back is where people sit when they are watching. When they are listening before they speak. Marcus was from Cleveland. His mother Diane worked the overnight shift at a hospital laundry facility. She had worked that shift for 11 years so that her hours would not overlap with Marcus's school schedule. So that someone would always be home when he woke up in the morning. His father Joseph had been a good man. A thoughtful man who loved jazz records and crossword puzzles. Joseph had died of a heart attack 4 years ago when Marcus was 15. And after Joseph died something had shifted in Marcus. He had pulled inward. Pulled toward numbers. Because numbers never left. Numbers never changed. Numbers were honest in a way that grief was not. By the time Marcus was 16 he had worked through every mathematics textbook in his school library. By 17 he had been quietly corresponding by email with a retired professor at Ohio State who had recognized something in the boy's questions. Something rare. Something that did not come along very often. That professor had written Marcus a letter of recommendation that used the word exceptional 7 times. But Professor Hartman did not know any of this. All he saw on that first Monday was a young black man in a worn hoodie sitting in the third row from the back. And in the narrow hallway of Gerald Hartman's assumptions. That image connected to a story he had already written. The story said, "This student will struggle. This student is here on an assistance program. This student will need extra help. This student does not truly belong in advanced algebraic structures." He told himself these things without realizing he was telling himself these things. That is how the most harmful assumptions work. They feel like observations. They feel like experience. They feel like wisdom. But they are none of those things. The first 2 weeks of the semester passed quietly. Professor Hartman lectured. The students took notes. Marcus filled page after page of his notebook with careful organized work. He rarely raised his hand. When he did, the answers were correct and precise. But correctness and precision from a quiet student in a worn hoodie did not register on Gerald Hartman's radar. What registered on his radar was performance. Confidence that looked like his own confidence had looked 30 years ago. And Marcus's confidence was quiet. Turned inward. The kind you only see if you are paying close enough attention. It was the third week of October when it happened. The lecture that morning was on a particular class of problems in algebraic number theory. Problems that required a specific kind of spatial and logical imagination. Problems that most advanced undergraduates found genuinely difficult. Hartman was at the board writing. He was in the middle of a long derivation. Moving through it quickly the way men do when they want to show how easily it comes to them. And then he made an error. A small one. But clear. Marcus saw it immediately. He sat with it for a moment. Turned it over in his mind to make sure he was right. He was right. He raised his hand. Professor Hartman turned from the board. His eyes found Marcus in the third row. There was a pause. A small pause that lasted less than a second but contained something that several students in that room would later remember. "Yes," said Hartman. His voice carrying just a note of something that was not quite patience. Marcus said calmly, "I think there might be an error in the substitution on line 4. The coefficient should be negative." The room went quiet. Hartman turned back to the board. He looked at line 4. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was wrong. The student was right. "Yes," he said after a moment. "A sign error." He corrected it and continued. He did not say thank you. He did not acknowledge that catching that error mid-derivation required genuine attention and skill. He simply corrected it and moved on. But something had shifted in him. Something small and uncomfortable. The kind of feeling that certain men turn into something else rather than examine it honestly. 2 days later Hartman arrived to class with something prepared. He had a problem. He had spent an evening finding it specifically. A problem from a 1987 research paper that had taken its authors months to solve. A problem that no undergraduate had any reasonable expectation of being able to work through in real time. He wrote it on the board in silence. The class looked at it. There were murmurs. Someone in the front row whispered something to the person next to them. Hartman let the silence stretch. Then he looked out across the room. And his eyes settled. Not on the strongest student in the front row. Not on the graduate student who sometimes audited the class. His eyes settled on Marcus Okafor in the third row from the back. "Mr. Okafor," he said. His voice carrying the particular smoothness of someone who has planned this moment. "This is a problem from advanced research literature. Would you like to come up and show us how to approach it?" The room shifted. Everyone understood the texture of what was happening even if they could not have named it precisely. The invitation was not an invitation. It was a stage. And the stage was not built for Marcus to succeed on. Marcus looked at the board. He looked at it for a long moment. 19 years old. 1 notebook. 1 pen. His mother working overnight shifts in a hospital laundry room in Cleveland. His father's jazz record still in a box under his bed back home. He stood up. He walked to the front of the room. He picked up a piece of chalk. And he began. The first thing the class noticed was that he did not hesitate at the board the way most students do. Most students at the board move cautiously. They write a little and pause and look back at the professor checking for approval. Marcus did not do that. He stood with his feet planted and he began working from the left side of the board moving right. His handwriting was clear and deliberate. Each line of work organized and purposeful. He did not perform confidence. He simply worked. The room was very quiet. Hartman stood to the side. His arms crossed. In the first 3 minutes he was certain the boy would slow down and stop. In the 5th minute he uncrossed his arms. In the 7th minute something moved across his face. Something that was not quite what he expected to feel. By the 10th minute Marcus had worked through an approach that Hartman had not seen before. Not the approach from the 1987 paper. A different approach. A more elegant approach. One that arrived at the same destination through a cleaner path. The student in the front row who had whispered earlier was now sitting perfectly still. Leaning forward slightly. Her pen not moving. Just watching. Marcus wrote the final line of the solution. He set the chalk down on the ledge. He turned to face the class. Not with triumph. Not with anger. Not with any of the performances that the moment might have invited. He simply stood there. Waiting. The room was quiet for 5 full seconds. Then someone started clapping. It was the student in the red hoodie 2 seats from the aisle. He just started clapping. And within a moment the whole room had joined him. Every student in room 214 of the mathematics building at Westbrook University. All of them. Clapping for the 19-year-old from Cleveland in the worn black hoodie. Marcus nodded once. Quietly. And walked back to his seat in the 3rd row from the back. Hartman stood at the front of his classroom. And for the first time in a very long time, Gerald Hartman did not know what to say. He dismissed class 10 minutes early that day. He told himself it was because they had covered enough material. But that was not why. He stayed in the empty room for a long time after the students left. Standing in front of Marcus's work. Reading through it carefully. Line by line. There was no error. There was not a single error. And the approach. The approach was something Hartman had not considered. It was the approach of someone who thought about mathematics differently than he did. More fluidly. More intuitively. With a kind of structural imagination that could not be taught in a classroom. It had to come from inside. It had to be something a person carried with them. Hartman picked up the eraser. He held it for a moment. And then he put it back down. He left Marcus's work on the board. He left the classroom. And he walked slowly down the echoing hallway of the old brick building. With the feeling of a man who has just seen something he cannot unsee. He found Marcus's file in the department records that afternoon. He sat at his desk and he read through it. The high school transcript. The letter from the retired professor at Ohio State. The 7 times the word exceptional appeared. He read the letter twice. He sat back in his chair. Outside his office window the October leaves were falling. Gold and red against the gray afternoon sky. Gerald Hartman was 61 years old. He had spent 22 years in this building. He had been certain for a long time. And certainty is a comfortable thing. It is warm and familiar like an old coat you have worn for years. But sometimes the coat has been covering something up. Something you needed to look at. Something you needed to sit with. He thought about his own father. A stern, quiet man who had judged people quickly and rarely revised his judgments. He thought about the moments in his own career when someone had believed in him before he had earned it. A mentor at the University of Michigan. A woman named Dr. Eleanor Ross who had seen past his rough edges and his arrogance when he was 23. Who had pushed him toward his best work. He thought about what it would have meant if someone like himself had been standing in the room watching him. Waiting for him to fail. The next morning Gerald Hartman arrived at room 214 early. Earlier than he had arrived in years. He stood at the board looking at Marcus's work which was still there exactly as it had been left. He was still standing there when Marcus walked in. Marcus stopped when he saw the professor. There was a cautious look in his eyes. The look of a young person who has learned to be careful in rooms where authority lives. Hartman turned to face him. He did not clear his throat. He did not reach for the comfortable smoothness of his professional voice. He just spoke. As one person to another. What you did yesterday, he said. I have been teaching this course for 22 years. I have never seen an undergraduate approach that problem the way you approached it. Marcus was still. Watching. I owe you an apology, Hartman said. The way I put you in that position in front of the class. He paused. That was not a fair thing to do. I thought I knew what I would see. He looked at the board. At Marcus's clean organized lines of work. I was wrong about what I would see. The room was quiet. Outside in the hallway there were sounds of other students arriving for other classes. Life moving at its ordinary pace. Marcus looked at the board for a moment. Then he looked back at Hartman. My father used to say, Marcus said quietly, that the most important thing a person can do is keep looking. Keep looking even when you think you already know what you're looking at. Hartman nodded slowly. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was, said Marcus. And he walked to the 3rd row from the back and sat down. The semester continued. Something had changed in room 214. Not loudly. Not dramatically. The way real change usually happens. Quietly. In small moments. In the way Hartman began calling on Marcus not to put him on display but to genuinely hear his thinking. In the way Marcus began sitting in the second row from the back. Then the second row. Then one morning in the middle of November. The front row. In the way other students began gathering around Marcus's desk before class to talk through problems. The way his notebook began to be passed around the room. His careful, deliberate handwriting shared like something valuable. Because it was. Hartman began staying after his office hours closed on Tuesdays. And Marcus began coming by on those Tuesdays. They would work through problems together. Not teacher and student exactly. Something more like two people who had found an unexpected common language. Hartman shared papers he had worked on. Marcus shared approaches that came from somewhere Hartman could not fully map. Could not teach. Could only be grateful to witness. One Tuesday evening in December, when the first snow of the year was falling outside the office window, Hartman asked Marcus what he wanted to do. After Westbrook. After the degree. Marcus looked at the falling snow for a moment. I want to work on problems that don't have solutions yet, he said. The ones where nobody knows the answer. The ones where you have to find a new way to even ask the question. Hartman nodded. He pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk. He took out a folder. Inside the folder were names. Contact information. Former students and colleagues at institutions across the country. People who worked on exactly those kinds of problems. Let me make some calls, he said. Marcus Okafor graduated from Westbrook University 3 years later. Summa cum laude. The department threw a small gathering after the ceremony. Diane Okafor was there. A woman with tired eyes and a wide, warm smile who shook Gerald Hartman's hand and held it with both of hers. Thank you, she said. That was all. But the way she said it. The weight of what she meant. Hartman understood it. He understood it in a way he might not have understood it at the beginning of that October semester. Marcus went on to doctoral work at a program Hartman had helped connect him to. He carried a plain notebook and a single pen just like he always had. And somewhere in a box that moved with him from Cleveland to Westbrook to his new city, there were still jazz records. His father's jazz records. Wrapped carefully in old newspaper. Because some things you carry with you. Not because they are heavy. But because they are true. There is something this story is really about. And it is not about a math problem. It is about what happens when we allow ourselves to be surprised. When we are willing to set down what we were certain we knew. And look again. Really look. With open eyes. Gerald Hartman was not an evil man. He was a man who had stopped looking. And Marcus Okafor did not change him by arguing or demanding or performing his worth for an audience. He changed him by simply being exactly who he was. Quietly. Persistently. Without apology. There are Marcus Okafors all around us. In schools and workplaces and families. Carrying something extraordinary in a worn hoodie. Waiting not for permission to shine. But for someone to finally stop assuming they already know what they are looking at. May we all be people who keep looking. May we all be people humble enough to be wrong. And wise enough to be grateful when someone shows us something we had not seen before. This has been a story from the Black Voices. If this story moved something in you. If it reminded you of someone you know. Or someone you once were. Or someone you are still becoming. Please take a moment and press the like button. Let us know this kind of storytelling matters to you. Share this with someone in your life who needs to hear it today. Maybe a young person who is still waiting to be seen. Maybe someone older who needs a reminder that it is never too late to look again. Subscribe to the Black Voices so you never miss a story like this one. And leave us a comment below. Tell us about a time when someone finally saw what you were carrying. Or a time when you realized you had not been looking closely enough at someone else. We read every single comment. Every single one. Because your voice matters here. This is the Black Voices. And we will see you in the next story.